Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Book Passage, our event tonight. My name is Julie Carlucci, and I want to do a special shout out first, before I forget, to all of our first edition club members from all over the world. It's so great to see so many familiar names and faces, so thanks for joining us. We are so proud and excited to have with us tonight JoAnne Tompkins to share with us her debut novel, What Comes After, which is also, as our members know, is our April first edition pick. This book, it's masterful writing. It is a literary wonder. It is debut novel gold. It is about the shocking murder-suicide of two teenage boys in a small Pacific Northwest town. And it's also about the journey of the two single parents trying to make sense of this unbearable loss and the arrival of a mysterious 16-year-old girl. We were taken with this book for its ability to unfold the universal truth about being human and the need for connection. We have the collective power to heal each other from the suffering of isolation and loss, which I think all of us can relate to after these past 18 months. The book expands your perspective of family and illuminates the necessity of our human interconnectedness to fully live through human suffering and joy. It's heart-wrenching, but it will leave you with feelings of hope, healing, and courage. JoAnne Tompkins was inspired to become a writer by the human resiliency and grace she observed in her first career as a trial lawyer, mediator, and judicial officer working with families in crisis. In conversation with JoAnne tonight, we have Amy Liu, the best-selling author of Glorious Boy, and also Flash House, Cold Mountain, and Face. She currently teaches in Goddard College's MFA program in creative writing at Port Townsend, Washington. She's had a colorful career, everything from being a flight attendant to being an associate producer at NBC Today Show. Amy will also be at another Book Passage event on Tuesday, April 27th at 6 p.m. with Pamela Feinsilber at the Meet the Author book group. So Amy and JoAnne, thank you for being with us tonight. I look forward to the conversation and let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you for that beautiful introduction. I was going to actually read a long Time magazine description of the book, but I think I'll let that go for now. We can coast on your introduction. I will say that I am so thrilled to be talking with JoAnne tonight because I was her MFA thesis advisor at Goddard, and What Comes After began at Goddard. We're really thrilled and proud. And in fact, when I read that early draft of it as her thesis, I called it, quote, a riveting and deeply moving novel in the tradition of Kent Haruf or Marilynne Robinson about family, faith, and forgiveness. And I'm really delighted that it's only become more so as you've worked on it, JoAnne, and developed it and revised it. And I don't think I ever asked, or if I asked way back in the beginning, I've forgotten. Could you tell us what the very first idea was for this novel, where it came from originally?
Sure, but first I want to say thank you to Book Passage for having this event, and to you, Amy, for doing this, because it's really fun. I really feel very much like Amy is a huge reason that I have a book now, and she's been an amazing support and was an amazing advisor and very passionate as she went through my manuscript. It was very fun to read her exclamations, not always good ones, right?
But, almost always.
but helpful ones. So the question was, what was the inkling of?
Yeah, where did it come from? What was the first genesis of it?
Well, you know how ideas stick in your head sometimes, and they keep bugging you and you feel like that there's a reason why they have remained in your head. And I mediated a case many years ago that involved the murder of a high school football player. And it was by two boys. And it was a very different murder than this, much worse than this one in many ways. But I met the mother in a mediation, and she was just such a good example of how people survive the unsurvivable. The two boys that murdered her son, she felt were her own sons. And she hugged their parents at the sentencing hearings. And I was just so tremendously moved by her and by what happened with these teenage, children, that I just felt like I wanted to explore some of that territory.
Wow. And we'll get into it, but I do want to know where Evangeline came from, but you can tell us later. So
Okay.
Let's start with Isaac. Book people always talk about thrillers as being propulsive page turners. And what comes after is absolutely that. It's got this incredibly propulsive pace, and it's got this deep mystery and all kinds of mysteries, interlocking mysteries, actually, that run through it. And yet it also has this incredibly meditative, spiritual quality. And a lot of that is because Isaac is a Quaker, he's a Stoic, he's incredibly reticent. I'm maybe repressed is too hard a word, but he's very closed up, and he is a gentle, sweet soul, but that soul really has a hard case around it. And I wonder if you could read us a little bit in Isaac's voice to introduce him, and then we can talk about him.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, I think I'm going to read something from, at this point, we know that Isaac knows that his son is dead and was killed by Jonah, who is like a second son to him. So he is really dealing with all this. And this is a chapter 3. News of my son's death traveled even faster than that of his disappearance. It was a loss felt by our entire community and made all the more painful by its violent cause, by Jonah's suicide, by Seattle news teams that swooped in to sensationalize. Many in town speculated about girls and jealousies, drug deals and psychotic breaks, but not one fact surfaced that lent the slightest credibility to any of it. The need for public outlets of grief was intense. Within the week, a student memorial was held in the school's overflowing gym. This was followed a few days later by a Catholic mass filled to capacity, mourners packed even in the vestibule. Catherine had insisted upon the mass. Though Daniel never considered himself Catholic, I didn't object. Catherine, who had divorced me the year before, grieved as deeply as I did. Likely more so, for having chosen to live elsewhere, for failing to be present the last 10 months of her son's life. I understood this and wished her whatever comfort she could find. Still, for my part, these events left me cold, and I am not a cold man. At least at one time, I was not.
Yeah. I had forgotten the part about the Catholicism and that Catherine was Catholic. So, I mean, there's so much about Isaac that I'm curious about. And a lot of it has to do with his being Quaker. I mean, the whole Quaker spirituality runs all the way through this book. And so where did he come from in you? Because all characters come from within us. So.
Well, sort of he came from with me, but he actually was somebody. I probably almost a decade ago, I went and stayed for nearly a month at Pendle Hill, which is a Quaker residential and learning community. And I participated in clearness committees, which I won't explain right now, but they're in the book, and they're a very, very deep Quaker process. And I did that over a span of multiple weeks. And when I left, one of the gentlemen that was in my group, I don't know, he sort of lives in me, right? I just feel like he's sort of inhabited me ever since then. And he just, in his own quiet way, seemed to want to speak. So that's where he came from.
Wow. What took you there to that community?
Well, I was going through some changes in my life, and was listening to a lot of, every week I listened to Bill Moyer's journal, and he regularly had on a gentleman named Parker Palmer, who had been an academic at Berkeley and other places, and ended up, when he was going through some major life changes, going to Pendle Hill. And he ended up, and I don't think he was originally Quaker, but he ended up staying for 10 years and was the dean. And he was the most gentle, wise, wonderful person. And I thought, well, if this guy could go, maybe I could go, right? So I just looked it up online, and sure enough, go. And they just happened to be having a sort of a special, if you will, about discerning your call, right? And I thought, well, that sounds perfect. It's like the universe landed it in my lap. And so off I went.
Wow. Yeah, I've read some of Parker Palmer's work. He is an extraordinary person. Yeah.
Isn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, really, really extraordinary. And yet the Quakerism stuck with you for this book, but not with you personally. You didn't become Quaker, right?
No, I didn't. But if I were to become anything, I would become a Quaker. The reason I didn't is I have come to realize about myself that I like being in transition zones. I like being at the edges of town, just kind of one foot in town and one foot out of town. I loved being there and sort of part of it. And I still sometimes attend Quaker meeting, and I was in a spiritual listening group with Quakers for years. But the second they asked me to join, I don't know, I got scared.
How did Isaac end up being the protagonist of a book that's really about teenage murder? And it's really, the story is located, the action all happens with the kids. So
Right.
How did Isaac end up being your primary protagonist? And was it hard to inhabit him as a man?
It didn't seem to be, I guess, because like I said, it almost felt like he had inhabited me for like 5 years. And even though it seems like it should have been difficult, but I think he was the person that I was most interested in, and I was interested in his loss. And then I found, but he's, like you said, he's very closed. And I needed, as a writer, and I certainly feel like the readers needed more lifefulness, right? I mean, he's not in a great place at the opening of the book. And I know that one of the things that makes life so interesting is lifefulness. And it's hard to avoid that when you're dealing with adolescents, right? They just got so much going on.
Yeah. The other thing, I guess, there's another thing about him that really interested me, and it's partly because, as we talked before, the theme of silent communication is something that I wrote about in Glorious Boy. It was really important in my book, and so I was interested that we had this kind of thread in common, because there's so much that is said in this book in silence, in Quaker meetings, and there's so much of the communication problem that occurs between Isaac and his son Daniel, because they don't talk the same language anymore. And I there's a lot of communication we'll get to later between the dog and I mean, there's a lot that's communicated in silence in this book. And I wondered if that theme was something that you had, maybe that came out of Quakerism, or was it something that you thought about before you got into the book, or did it just kind of evolve out of the characters?
I do think it's really interesting that both of our books have that, right?
Yeah.
That there's something really interesting to me about silence, and when I went and stayed with the Quakers, what struck me is how difficult silence is in our culture to feel comfortable with. It took me weeks, I was just sort of really getting into it after about a month. And I think that, and it's interesting to me to explore it with my characters, because just like anything, right, whether it's activity or silence or stillness, it depends what motivates you toward that, right? So, for poor Isaac, part of his motivation towards silence isn't just spiritualism, but his need to hide out from relationships, out from the world, and hide out from his own suffering. And he has to come to understand silence in a different way, in a way that gets him to his heart and to his own woundedness and to what is before him in the moment. So that was just a really interesting thing for me to explore.
Yeah, I think it's a great topic. I mean, it wasn't really until I was writing my book that it really dawned on me how dependent we are as a society on verbal, words going back and forth. And of course, as writers, we live in words and we love words. So it was quite an awakening to me to think about how many cultures and how many forms of communication don't involve words. In fact, where words get in the way, which I guess is very central to the Quaker belief that sometimes the most direct communication has nothing to do with words. Evangeline is the second key character in the book, and she's at the outset, she's been abandoned by her mother, and she's left pregnant and homeless and completely alone at age 16. But she has this incredible grit and openness that makes her really irresistible. Like all the characters in the book, she's deeply flawed, but also just completely lovable, and not in a saccharine way at all. I mean, deeply lovable. But could you read a bit from her perspective to introduce her?
Sure. So I'm going to read a little section of her where she's been living for months in a trailer in the woods that her mom had rented and left her in, and she's been getting eviction notices and receives one that basically the sheriff's going to be knocking on her door in about a week. So this is evening. She has left the trailer and she's scouting town. She's kind of looking down on the town and trying to make a plan for herself, because that is one thing I really love about Evangeline. She's a survivor. She's been through a lot. And she's a survivor, and she kind of has faith in that ability to survive. What she doesn't have faith in is her ability to be loved or to love. And that's one of her journeys she has to face in the book. But so this is from where she has ventured out and just kind of looking at the town. As she rounded a corner, the lights of town crept into view, strung along the shore below. When she'd arrived with her mother in the spring, Evangeline had thought the place was nothing more than a half dozen blocks of old buildings. But even from this modest elevation, you could see that it was much larger. Port Furlong fanned out for a few miles from a corner that jutted into the Sound, sprawled across multiple low-slung hills, surrounded a small lake. The Victorian settlers had savaged dense firs, stripped the earth for their buildings and homes and family farms. Grand trees still stood in parks and along rural roads, but in town, people had taken their place. 10,000 people, more in the summer, her mother had said. Now the whole of the town glittered, and Evangeline thought how this haunted old place woke each night. Ghosts wandering the turrets and gables and widows' walks of the Victorian homes. Even downtown, with its massive brick courthouse and post office, with its finials and balustrades and rows of high arched windows, seemed to bustle with the shadows of century-old business deals, with stiffly dressed couples floating through brick walls, seeking marriage licenses or letters from across the sea. And beyond all this was the Sound, where she could feel as if tossing inside herself, the sailboats and tugs and ferries that pitched in the water's black churn. Homes glowed on the hill above the town. She imagined the dinners and homework and family conversations taking place in those lighted rooms, and wondered if she would ever belong somewhere like that, and a house she could walk into day after day, knowing you were home, knowing you were wanted. No, she thought, she never would. Yet she touched her belly and whispered, "But you will, baby, you will."
I love her so much. And I thank you for reading that section, because I know you call it Port Furlong, but it's so Port Townsend.
It is.
For anybody watching, JoAnne lives in Port Townsend, and we used to have our residencies in Port Townsend. And every detail of this town is so familiar to me and rings so true, right down to the ghosts. I mean, I'd forgotten about the ghosts in there. It's so great and it's so vivid. Your writing just brings everything right to life. And I love that it's through Evangeline's eyes in that way.
Well,
She
I just have
based
to
on,
say,
oh,
I have to say that you are to be credited for that, because I think at some point you mentioned that I needed to bring my setting more to life, and I took it to heart.
you sure did. Is Evangeline also based on someone real, or?
She's really an amalgam. I mediated with I was around adolescent girls because I have a daughter, and I certainly remember my adolescence. And I remember as an adolescent thinking, I am going to remember this. I remember having very strong feelings about being an adolescent, and I did remember. But I had one particular girl that is at least a little bit of a seed, because she had been through unspeakable trauma. I mean, more trauma than even Evangeline. And yet she was so fierce and so alive. And I just wanted to capture that.
Oh, I think you did her well.
Yeah.
She would be very proud, I'm sure, if she knew. So there's one writerly craft question about her, and that's the decision to do her sections in third person. Isaac's in first person, and we'll get to Jonah in a minute. He's in first person. How did you come to decide? I believe there was some backing and forthing on that in the process, right?
There was backing and forthing. I tried. I tried to write her in first person. I tried several different times to write her, and she was just not right in first person. And it is really interesting to me that the two male voices I have in first, and I tried to write them in third and couldn't. I mean, and I think that part of that may be that the male voices, I felt like I had to actually crawl inside them and look out at the world through their eyes to really inhabit them, to get them, right? That was the only way I could really see something more than just my image of, a teenage boy or my image of a man. And, but with Evangeline, it was almost like too close. Like there was too much my own and my history and the people I dealt with, that I almost needed the distance of the third voice to look at her and see her maybe a little more objectively, or at least with more detail.
Fascinating. So that third protagonist, or the third narrator, is Jonah, the boy who killed Isaac's son. And Jonah's situation is so fraught. He was Daniel's best friend. They grew up together, next door neighbors, and he's like a second son to Isaac. He actually went to Quaker meetings with Isaac. I mean, I think it's such an interesting relationship that you've created there. And he is so intensely sensitive and also traumatized in ways that are, sort of very much ride beneath the surface. And most people don't catch them until it's too late. Can you read us a section in Jonah's voice?
Okay, well, here's a little section. Now, one thing that you do need to know is, I mean, he's dead at the opening of this book. So his sections are out of sequence because he's actually talking in present tense in the last few hours of his life. And he will talk about Red in this section. And the reason he talks about Red, who is Evangeline, is because Evangeline never gave him her real name. She met the two boys in the park at night. She was a little wary and she just wasn't about to use her real name. So that's who he's referring to when he talks about Red. So this is the first time in the book that you hear from him. It's chapter 7, Day of My Death. It's 12:15 in the morning. I'll be dead in a few hours, or at the most. I'm not looking for pity. It's just how things are. I'm wearing lug-soled boots and canvas work pants, laying on top of my bed, a hard-sprung twin pressed against a wall. Something rattles and bangs outside. It's nothing, just the wind knocking over a rake. My mom and little sister are asleep in their rooms. I suppose Mom could be awake with the racket, but I doubt it, not after her long day. And I'd know if Nels was. If we took out a wall, our beds would be touching. They'll figure out later that I said goodbye to them a few hours back. It's been 10 days since I met Red. The first time she looked at me, all I could think was, now that girl's eyes could slice a guy wide open. There was this crazy relief in being seen like that and believing that Red knew me. Later, when her lips touched my cheek, in front of Daniel no less, it burned so much that spot had to be glowing like some holy tattoo. You couldn't touch that girl without feeling your skin had disappeared, that you'd turn to water and float into a warm ocean. I'd give anything to touch Red one last time, to place a fingertip at the pulse of her throat, feel her life there, right there, hot and beating and contained. She's alive, that girl. So much she believes is possible. That's why I'm using these last few hours to figure things out. For her, she needs to know she's not to blame. I've only got my thoughts now, and I'm hoping that somehow they'll make their way to her. Not that I could begin to tell you in what world that would really happen, but it's pretty hard not to believe in unknown realms when that's exactly where you're heading.
So is he writing in a journal? Is that how you're thinking of it? Or is it just his voice thinking? I mean, how did you kind of
Richardson is
conceptualize that?
how I conceptualized it. A lot of people interpret it as he's writing in a journal. And I think because in the book, you'll see at the top of each of his sections, day of my death, right? So it's fine if people think he's writing in a journal, but when I wrote it, I was thinking he is just laying on that bed, trying to sort out his life and trying to sort of send those thoughts out into the universe, hoping that they somehow get to her so she can understand that she isn't to blame for what happened.
Wow, it's such a gutsy move to do that and to break open the narrative and bring him back. It's really an interesting structural decision, and I applaud you.
Thank you.
He's such a sweet guy. How come not Daniel? How come we don't hear from Daniel?
I feel like I'm a very organic writer and one that relies very heavily on my intuition, and he just wasn't there. But even if I was analytical about it, I would say when you're like me and I've been writing for some time before I started writing this book, you don't have any idea anyone's ever going to read your book, right? You don't know that. So you have to be willing to accept that you will spend years on something that, you and a few friends might read, and that's about it. And so I wanted to make sure that I was spending time in a way that I thought would benefit me. And one of the things that I write for is to expand my own empathetic imagination. So I wanted to understand, I wanted to be in the head of this boy who had done this horrible, horrible, unspeakable act and try to understand him as a full human. And that's why I chose him.
Okay, and there's another character who's probably my favorite character, has always from the beginning been my favorite character, because I've never seen anybody write about a dog the way you write about Rufus in this book. And Rufus is kind of the magic that brings everybody together. He connects with Evangeline, and I credit Rufus entirely with Isaac taking Evangeline in, because Rufus finds her outside under the tree in the middle of the night and connects with her in this kind of metaphysical way, and then becomes her best buddy, and then later on becomes absolutely critical to everything that happens toward the end of the book. And for those who haven't read it, Rufus is a pit bull lab mix. And here's what I wrote about the dog's relationship with Evangeline way back in 2017. Jaw-dropping powerful, it's so true and so deeply felt. I ached with the sorrow and the beauty of that dog's love. And he's even better now after
Mhm.
all of the development and revision and polishing. And you got to tell us, is he based on a real dog? And how did he come into this story? How did that evolve?
Well, if there is an autobiographical element to the story, it is Rufus, because Rufus is based on a dog, my great dog love of my life. And I hope, well, fortunately, the dog I have now that's just sitting by me, he's deaf, so he can't hear me say that. So, but I love him too. And I have loved all my dogs. But there was one dog I had, and he was a Pit Bull Lab Mix, who just seemed like this extraordinary being. He seemed like an enlightened being. I mean, he was definitely a dog. He had all the gross, doggy things, but he also always just intuitively knew um, what people needed. I mean, he might know that somebody was sad 2 floors above where he was, and he would run up there and go and lay his head in their lap. And so I had actually, I don't know if I ever told you this, I had tried to write a memoir about him, and it was really, really sad and terrible memoir, and I gave up on it. But when I read that was writing this book, I thought, well, the boys need a dog, I could fictionalize my dog. And so that's what I did.
Oh, he's so sweet. He's just
Yeah.
really, really. Okay, I'm not going to go into that because I'll give too much away if we keep talking about the dog. It's interesting. There are so many different ways this story could go, given the events that had happened. And at the end, I think it becomes a story that's very much about atonement. Another thing that I think both of our books have in common is that atonement plays a big role. Was that there from the beginning, or did you just leave yourself wide open to take this situation and see where it took you?
I love that you asked that question, because one of my favorite books of all time is Atonement by Ian McEwan, right? And I read it multiple times and I just adore it. That said, I that is not a word that I had in my head when I was writing the book. And actually at no point. And so it's interesting when you say back, because I go, of course, the book is very much about atonement. And so it seems like such an important thing that we all need to be thinking about. I think, or at least feeling, I think inside of us, we all have things that we would hope we could atone for.
Yeah. So I've never asked this before. I should say that I worked with you in your final semester. So I didn't see this book when it was first starting. And I think one of the most remarkable things about it is this combination of it being, what I would describe as a meditative thriller, a spiritual thriller. It's such an interesting kind of book creature or literary phenomenon. Did that, was that meditative quality there from the very beginning, or did you start out writing more of a conventional kind of mystery, legal thriller kind of thing? Or how did that tone come into play?
The parts that are mystery, and I mean, I don't really think of my book as either a mystery or a thriller, although I recognize that there are elements of that. When I wrote the book, it really was intended to be a deep dive into character and the character's arc toward rejoining life and community and family and love. And so the book was really more oriented toward that in the early drafts. And but I know that when I am reading a book, as much as I can love books that do those deep dives, I need to have something, that is pulling me forward, right? And the reality is life is very mysterious. I mean, all of us, we never know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? So that is the nature of life. So I wanted my book to be at least as interesting as my day-to-day life, right? And have these mysteries that were unfolding, where the characters don't know what's going to happen next. And so a lot of that was just done through thinking through, well, what are the mysteries for these people after I had a draft, really? And how do I structure this book to lift that to the surface?
Oh, bravo, because it really is extraordinary. We've got a question here, and it's from Kimmy Hardesty, one of our Goddard alums.
Hi,
So
Kimmy.
hi, all of you Goddard alums. We can't see you. We don't know if you're there, but if you want to pose a question to us with your name, then we'll know you're there. And so Kimmy asks, I'm not that far into the book, but I noticed the chapters are pretty short. I'm wondering if there was a specific purpose in this structure.
It seems to be my natural writing style. So I didn't really, I personally like short chapters because I think I'm kind of a little bit ADD maybe when I'm reading. If I see a really long chapter, I'm way more apt to put it down. So I'm oriented toward short chapters. I personally like to read short chapters. But even beyond that, I just found that I would say what I had to say and then I was done. And so there I was, and they just were short.
Did you work on getting them all about the same length? I mean, sometimes that's a strategy and sometimes they're all over the map, but did you look at structure that way as you were revising?
Actually, I worked at trying to make them a little less all the same length because I do tend to have, these chapters that tend to be in the 4 to 5 page range. And then it does seem to be where I want to move on to something else. And so sometimes I did combine chapters, actually. Some of the chapters that are a little longer were purposely combined.
Great. So one of my questions has to do with the title, because when we were working on your thesis, it was called Quickenings, which I thought was this great kind of triple entendre title because it referred to the Quaker practice of waiting in silence at meetings for the quickening that suggests a call from the soul to speak. And it refers to the first movement of a baby during pregnancy. And it also refers to sort of that first moment when you realize that you're feeling love for somebody else. And I love that. So I'm curious how we went from Quickenings to what comes after. Was that your decision? Was it something that kind of evolved during the publication prep period, or?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I sold it as Quickenings, and my agent seemed to love the title. My editor at Riverhead loved the title, and that was the title going forward up until essentially jacket design. And so one of the things that's interesting to me, I mean, there were two things. I mean, Quickenings, I love that title, but people don't know what it means. And so it has to be explained. The other thing that's true about Quickenings, if you were to look it up on Amazon, it's associated with horror, right? You'll see many Quickenings, raised from the deep, and it's
Really?
Think about Frankenstein. He's a quickening, I mean, it is definitely, quickening is a horror trope. So, so there was that worry. And then there was just this very practical worry that you learned that to put 11 letters, one word on a cover that begins with a Q, which is a weird letter, right? In terms of when you're looking at fonts, it just created a cover problem. But I have to give Riverhead this. They at no point insisted that I change the name at all. They loved the title. They just said, here are things we would like a title that more clearly reflected and more easily reflected the nature of your book. And so if, just think about it. And so I did. And, we threw out a lot of titles, but actually my partner was talking to me one night and he said, your book is about what comes after. And he was going on. I go, oh my God, there it is. Right. I thought, yes, that is what it's about. And I can say that I am actually really thankful right now that is the title, because it could be easy for people to get caught up in the underlying violence. But the book is, and that is there. And there are elements, but the book is about what comes after, right? Mm-hmm. And it helps me help people understand that the book that they would be reading, if they decide to read it, is not a book that's got, murder and suicide and terrible things on every page. That's, in essence, backstory. And this is about people learning to be alive again and connected again and seeing what are their opportunities for connection in the present moment.
Beautiful. So I should say that, you know, your publishing experience has been amazing.
Yeah.
I've been in the business for a very long time, and I've been absorbing for especially the last 10 to 20 years, all the conventional wisdom about, well, you know, people who get published have to have a platform, they have to have a brand, they have to be social media mavens, they have to do this, that, and the other thing. You have to have a blog, you have to have a, you know, all this stuff. And I just love the fact that you kind of didn't. And can you sort of tell us a little bit about how you went about getting this book published? So I know that you'd gone to some writers' conferences before you came to Goddard, and we worked on this beautiful book while you were at Goddard and got it to what I consider to be pretty, you know, obviously needed a bit more revision, but it was well on its way. So what did you do after you graduated?
Well, it is important to talk a little bit about what I did before I ever got to Goddard, which was that I had been attending, you know, a lot of workshops, right, in the Pacific Northwest, at Squaw Valley, at Breadloaf. And each time, if I had an opportunity to meet an agent, I snagged it. I went up and introduced myself. I said I was a writer, even if I didn't have anything that I could send to them at the moment, because that would allow me to like send out queries to them saying, I met you at this point, I was really impressed with you, and here's my book. And that gets you out of the slush pile. So that was really, really important. So I'd been doing that. And I had been, you know, looking at books I admired that I felt were at least what I was attempting to aim toward, and seeing who represented those people and making a list of agents. And so, you know, and after, when I had my thesis and did some more revision on it after graduation, I went to the people that I had kind of collected their names. And some of them, I did have actually a prior novel that did not get published, right? And that was before I ever came to Goddard. And so some of those people had been very kind to me and said, well, if you have something else, you know, send it to me. So, and they all kind of asked for the manuscript when I contacted them. So I would say to those writers out there, you know, if you have a book that doesn't find an agent, but you have agents that are responding to your work and seeing merit in it, that's a really good sign. And don't feel it's the end of the world, because that is sort of what helped me in the end. And so then I did send it to my incredible agent, Susan Gollum, at Writer's House. And I did not know her. I had not had contact with her. She had not seen my prior work, which is probably a good thing. And she ultimately contacted me, and we had a long conversation. And she wasn't ready to take it, but she was interested. And she had a whole bunch of ideas of what could make it better. And this goes to what you asked earlier, right? You asked about, was it meditative and was it a thriller? And honestly, she was the one who said, you need to make this more propulsive. That word propulsive, I can't tell you how many times I heard it from people throughout this process. And so it was a real big learning curve of how to do that. And she worked with me. And so I did another draft, and then she took me on as a client, and then we did another draft and another big edit. And it was almost exactly a year from when we first talked to when it was actually going out to editors. So it was a big process.
Tell us how you selected her, how you decided to write to her, send the manuscript cold to her. How did you pick her?
Well, I knew who she represented. And I was impressed with who she represented. She represents Jonathan Franzen, Rachel Kushner, and Bolo Pue. And I just thought she was awesome. So I just thought, well, what the heck, right? You know, and she was supposed to be a squaw when I was there, and that was one reason why she came to mention it. She ended up not being able to make it at the last minute, so I didn't get a chance to meet her there. But that was actually, even that, I could email her and say, you know, this is a query from Squaw Valley, and say I had hoped to meet you there, but I didn't get a chance to. So even these tiny little things, near misses, can get help.
Right. Kimmy's asking, what are some of the books you admired, and are they books by Jonathan Franzen and Rachel Kushner? And are these, is there a direct line there between the books you love and the books that inspired you to go to Susan? Or
you know, oddly, I would say no. I mean, I love those books, but I think they're very, very different books than than my books, and they write very differently. I was just more impressed with her. And also I had read in Poets and Writers that she is, and this is very true, as my own story shows, that she likes taking on debut novelists, even though she just has this huge list. And she really likes and enjoys working with debut novelists to get their work to the best possible place. So she just seemed like a fantastic agent. So the people that I kind of resonate with in terms of my own work are, I mean, I'm just always reading Marilyn Robinson, Elizabeth Strout, Alice Munro. I'm also crazy, and you may not see this in my work, but I am crazy for George Saunders. And I feel like his influence is in there and some of the more mystical aspects of my work.
Great, great. And what are you reading now?
You know, and this is a thriller, I just finished reading Miracle Creek by Angie Kim. And in part I did that because she did an event with me a few days ago. But she's awesome. And I have to say, Miracle Creek and she was a lawyer like me, and Susan Gollum is also her agent. So we had all of these combinations. First of all, she is just this wonderful, generous person. And secondly, her Miracle Creek is I would say, a genuine, complicated, interesting, fascinating thriller, as well as being very character driven. And she's working in the same things that you, Amy, are working in, and I'm trying to work in, which is this sort of deep dive into humanity, right? And what makes us who we are, and who makes us who we are across socioeconomic, and in your book in particular, Amy, I mean, with, you know, race and, you know, ability, and so many things that you're exploring in your work. And those are the things that I admire and am inspired by.
Right. Yeah. The question was to me too, and I what am I reading? And I just finished reading. I took a break from fiction to read Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, which I will just make a point of saying I think it should be mandatory reading for everybody in America. It has it's on race relations and going back, and she connects the dots through history, through politics, through climate, through everything in a way that just has completely blown me away. And I can't believe that I haven't put the picture together in the way that she's put it together before in my life. It's really, because once you start to see what she puts in front of you, it's absolutely inescapable. And it will, I think, if everybody watching this were to read it, I think it would change everybody's life in terms of the way you look at this society. It's really, really stunning. And it's not overly complicated. It's very accessible. It's very well done and really, really smart. So I will put in a plug for that.
I have to read that. Oh my God.
Sometimes even fiction writers have to read nonfiction to kind of get the basic template. So I think that's what that's about. So let's talk about Riverhead. How did you, I mean, I know they made you a very nice offer, but aside from that, how did you know that Riverhead was the one for you? Why were they your first pick?
They have just an amazing track record. I mean, first of all, they're fairly a small imprint of Penguin Random House, and they just represent the most amazing authors, Khaled Hosseini, Elizabeth Gilbert, the Dalai Lama, James McBride. I mean, they just have such a great list of people. And they have a reputation, much like my agent, for really investing in the careers of their authors. And so I really had such a positive image of them. And my agent did as well. And she was very important. And she was very clear that that would be a great one to go with. And I just really could not ask for a more positive experience with them. They have really wanted to help me get this book to the best conceivable level, and not by being intrusive. I mean, it isn't like I got a lot of line editing, but like Sarah McGrath, my editor, would ask the most, for me, profound questions. She would say something like, "What are you trying to say about evil?" Right? And I would go, "Oh, yes, I am trying to say something about evil." And I asked her, I said, "Well, what do you think I'm trying to say about evil?" And she told me, and I go, "No, that's not what I'm trying to say about evil." So that was so informative, right? And so I was able to, and I loved it, because it's sort of like when you're in a book group, right? And people bring things to the book group, and all of a sudden, I don't know that some books that I don't fully appreciate until after book group, I come to love by the process of discussing them. And there was something about that process with Sarah that really forced me to dive really, really deep into what I'm trying to do. And if I was trying to skate by on any character, I don't know, she was not having it, right? I mean, it was like, no, you need to go a little bit deeper here. And that's what every writer probably needs, but I definitely need.
That is solid gold today, because you hear all the time that editors are too busy to edit. So when you have editors who really will give you that kind of time and attention, it's wonderful. I should say, I know a lot of editors, they all try to, but the loads that many of them bear just doesn't make it all that possible. So there's a question here from Kim Rogers about the pandemic, which is one of the questions I was going to ask you, which is, this book was with Riverhead for several years before it came out, and was the publication date was pushed back a couple of times, was it? Or was it pushed back because of the pandemic? Or
It actually was not pushed back because of the pandemic. It was pushed out because of the election. There was some thought about putting it out last fall, and I'm thankful that Riverhead felt like it wasn't a good time to put out a debut novel, that election was just going to be all consuming, and it would be hard to float up to the top in that kind of situation. And so that was the main reason, because actually the date was set before the pandemic hit. And at the time, well, I had hoped that it would come out a year ago, and oh my gosh, I feel so lucky, because I know that, when your wonderful book, Glorious Boy, came out, you were just dealing with a pandemic, right? And it was
Sure were.
It was a very, very different time, right? Because now they've had a year to figure out how to deal with the pandemic. But back then, the publishers were just, and all the poor authors, right?
Yeah, I know. I just can't get over the statistic that was in the New York Times that I told you about earlier. 98% of the books published last year sold fewer than 5,000 copies, which for anybody watching is a very, very small number. And a lot of the authors that I know who were published last year, I circulated that. There's a big group of us called Lockdown Writers, and they were also actually grateful to see that statistic, because we've all been sitting there just thinking our books are terrible, nobody wants them, and it really was because of the pandemic. So it's a terrible figure, but at least it's kind of a relief to know that it's not a reflection of our books. There's one more question here from Linda Mitchell. How do you think your experience as a lawyer influenced your characters? You've told us a little bit about that, but I wonder if you have any more thoughts on that.
It's so interesting. I was on a podcast earlier today, and the woman who was interviewing me's husband was a lawyer, and she asked me that very question. And she said that her experience with her own husband was that, and I think this is so true, that as a lawyer, as a mediator, of course, I had to be able to see through everybody's eyes because I had to be in the room and feel like they understood that I understood them. But even if you're representing one side, if you're going to be a successful lawyer, you need to like leap to the other side in your mind, think through, how they see the world. What are they going to be? What were the arguments you'd make if you were them? And you really need to be able to be in a bunch of heads, and you need to look at your jury if you're doing trial work and imagine their lives and who they are and how they're going to look out onto the world. So yes, I do think that especially as a trial lawyer or a judge or a mediator, it's absolutely a job requirement that you be able to inhabit the minds of other people and understand the world from their perspective.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think we are just at 7 o'clock now, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if Julie's coming back to say goodbye for us.
I think there she
There
is.
she is. There she is.
Thank you so much. What a rich discussion. And, I always say, like, reading fiction is the most effective way to understanding our humanity. And so, and it's because of the books that you guys write and the interest that you have and, how you try to unfold that for the reader. And so, I'm Amy, I'm so excited to go back to the store and pick up your book and rediscover it, because I just feel books like this, like What Comes After, and books that just kind of like really deep go into the soul and help us understand us as a species, as like how we work together as a society. It's just a gift. So thank you guys both. I encourage everyone to pick up the book. We still have some signed first editions, just a few, at the store. So order it quickly. And thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. And thank you everyone out there for joining us.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you to Book Passage for hosting.
Yes, absolutely.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.